Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. We are here in the studio that we put together, our quarantine studio. Very excited about this. I think it's finally come together. I'm reading your notes. Definitely give me feedback. Again, I'm building the studio per Dorsey, our producer's advice. So it's been a struggle, but it's also been a great release for me, something to focus on when there's just so much crazy stuff happening out there in the world, and a lot of bad news and a lot of mismanagement by our government. We're going to try to focus a little bit on politics today. There's a lot of politics that's emerged out of the COVID crisis, and there's a lot of politics that continues to exist. Really, as the country is focusing on extremely important matters, there is still a primary that's going on. And there's still other things, budgets that are being passed in different states, issues that we need to discuss. So I'm excited to have a couple guests on today that will discuss some of these issues. And of course, you know who these people are because they're friends of the show. The first guest that we have today is Michael Brooks. Michael Brooks, of course, the host of the Michael Brooks Show, dear friend, not just of the show, of really, he's a great colleague of mine, and he's given me so much advice on building this show up. But he is coming on not to talk about politics, a little bit of that. He's mainly coming on to make fun of me. But aside from that, he's on to talk about his new book, Against the Web, a cosmopolitan answer to the new right. And then our second guest today is David Moore, who is the co-founder of Sludge. David Moore is a great investigative reporter following the money of the DNC. Very DNC heavy show today, guys. So I hope you're ready for it. I listened to your messages. When you send me notes, especially patrons, I pay attention. So we're going to work really hard to bring you guys the show that you deserve, that you want. There's a lot of news that is not being delivered. And we're going to focus on some of the deeper stuff, some of the more institutional stuff, understanding the infrastructure of the party and really how things work, because we can't stop that fight because we have another crisis. We unfortunately have to do a lot of things at once. But really excited about this show. If you are not a patron on Patreon, this is the time to support independent. I'm going to be completely honest with you. We're really worried. Those of us in independent media are worried that not only are folks watching a lot of corporate media because they need the raw news, as we discussed last week with David Dole from the Rational National, but the economy it's very unstable right now. A lot of people have lost their jobs. They don't know what their economic future is going to be, and independent media is largely funded by donations and contributions from individuals. And so if you cannot continue your patronage, I really ask that you message me, because I will work something out. We are a new show. We're only 2 months old. So every little contribution actually does make a difference. If you can, dig a little bit deeper, maybe sponsor another member, we're going to come up with different ways of supporting our patrons. But you've been the lifeblood of this show. And I am very grateful that you've invested in us, because not only were we able to build a studio, but we have a brilliant producer and content and research and getting guests, and it's a real operation. So just so grateful that you support our show and all independent media, because now is the time when, during crises, as I'm sure you're starting to see, this is when authoritarian types and the establishment likes to pull fast ones on us. It's unfortunate. It just shows their true colors, but those who are in power are politicians, and a lot of them don't have ethics or morals, or they want to find a way of balancing the crisis with their own goals. And this is why we need independent media to shine a light on this. They're in bed with the corporate media. They have the same backers, and we don't. We have you. So if you want to see the show grow, we're just really grateful. If you're not already subscribing on YouTube, subscribe. Please click like, click share. Please let your friends know about the show. We're also a little bit worried about demonetization that might happen during this crisis, because people are driving so hard towards corporate media and algorithms benefit. So we're grateful to you. We have a great show. Stick around. If Donald Trump is to blame for being in denial about this COVID crisis, for refusing masks, health supplies, and guidance from the WHO in the late 2019, or for pushing the CDC austerity and eliminating pandemic disaster preparedness planning. And if the GOP governors who take their cues from the president are just as negligent for refusing to shut down beaches and institute stay-at-home orders far into the evidentiary phase of this crisis, if they're to blame, where does the buck stop? Just 2 weeks ago, DNC Chairman Tom Perez willfully ignored scientists and the CDC's own advisory to ban social gatherings of over 10 people. Perez advised Democratic voters to listen to their states. So he basically told voters to trust Republican Governor DeSantis of Florida and Republican Governor Ducey of Arizona to show up at the polls during a pandemic. And even though, despite public outrage and pushback, Perez stuck to his plan, and those primaries took place. Just a few days later, the Florida poll workers, few of them, tested positive for COVID-19. By the way, Joe Biden earned 173 delegates in Florida and Arizona. But then on Tuesday of this week, Tom Perez criticized Republican leadership and judges in Wisconsin for putting politics above lives, continuing to hold in-person primaries in the midst of a pandemic. Did Tom Perez suddenly learn his lesson? This week, while everyone is absorbed with COVID, Perez announced the DNC was moving the convention from July to August. And hidden in that story is that Perez decided on this only after speaking with Joe Biden, who pushed for the DNC convention not to be canceled, but to be postponed. Is it that the former vice president and the DNC chair are just that out of touch? Or are their political instincts that inept? Or do they think this is a smart strategy to win the White House? Or is this just something else? Spoiler alert, I've come to the point where I am almost absolutely certain that the Biden campaign and the DNC have no interest in winning in the fall. Why? Well, as always, you gotta follow the money. There is a whole lot of money in opposition politics, in being the anti-Trump Democrats. A few years ago, a clip went viral of me speaking on the DNC's Unity Reform Commission, in which I served. It was from the last meeting as we geared up to vote on important budgetary and conflicts of interest reforms that Dr. Jim Zogby and I had written. And it was after a year of traveling the country, meeting over long weekends, deliberating, and in my case, researching the complicated structure and the finances of the DNC. And in that clip, I referenced a handful of consultants who earned the majority of the $1 billion spent on the 2016 election, between Clinton's presidential campaign, the joint agreement with the DNC, and the Clinton-aligned super PACs. One of the largest consultants, receiving hundreds of millions of dollars, was a firm called SKD Knickerbocker. It's out of New York. Now, a critic might say to me, hold up, Nomi, elections cost money, and someone's got to do that work. Which, okay, sure, is true enough. But consulting isn't known to be the most ethical profession, and many, not all, consultants will prey on candidates who can and have raised money. And more often than not, behind closed doors, there's political horse trading going on between consultants. Some consultants would rather make money off of a campaign than actually fight hard to win that campaign. And oftentimes, the candidates may not even know this. You may remember that the Democrats lost over 1,000 state legislative seats during Obama's tenure in leading the DNC. This is largely because the Democrats pulled funding away from the 50-state strategy that got Democrats the House in 2006. A strategy focused on investing in building a pipeline of candidates, leaders, organizers, and activists across the country. But instead, under Obama's leadership, the money largely moved into solely funding his presidential campaigns, which, let me remind you, have become a billion-dollar business opportunity. And for the establishment, the more national a race, the more expensive ads to buy, the more money to be charged on communications and less on organizers and door-to-door canvassers. The more to be consolidated towards a couple of big consultants than towards a decentralized county-by-county model of funding thousands of local people. And SKD Knickerbocker was one of these key firms raking in that money. And they also happen to be working with Vice President Biden. Anita Dunn, one of the partners, who's the D in SKD, is the senior advisor to Joe Biden. You might remember her appearance on TV the night of the last debate at the beginning of the pandemic, when she called Bernie Sanders a protester on stage. This is the same Anita Dunn, this is the same Anita Dunn, who made money defending her client, Harvey Weinstein, a huge Democratic Party donor also. But then she also worked with the Hollywood Time's Up legal fund supporting Me Too victims. The same Time's Up that was recently reported to have refused to look into substantiated sexual assault allegations against Joe Biden by Tara Reid, a former staffer to the senator. And another partner at SKD is someone I actually know from my time at CNN and the DNC, Hillary Rosen. You may remember Hillary from her recent tiff with Senator Nina Turner on CNN, when Hillary, a white woman and a Biden consultant, said to Senator Turner, an African-American woman, that she had no standing to interpret Martin Luther King Jr.'s words. Then, even 24 hours later, Hillary Rosen continued this rant on Twitter until it reached embarrassment. She was trending, and she was forced to apologize to Senator Bernie Sanders and to Senator Turner, perhaps for CNN contract. Now, this is a firm that has lobbied for tax breaks for the wealthy, for-profit schools. They've worked with Israeli spy companies, and SKD represents friend of the Nomiki show, Governor Andrew Cuomo. So what does this have to do with the convention? So Joe Biden's campaign has been a magic trick by his media consultants. He barely has volunteers, and I don't think he ever had a field program. It's been bizarrely dependent on mainstream media hyperventilating over his expected win in South Carolina and a lineup of endorsements from lockstep fall-in-line Democrats. Basically, his media consultants constructed a scenario in which the media could get away with saying Biden was the presumed nominee well before the primaries were completed. Like, half the primaries have even cast a vote. So the firm have had their own strategists who happen to be cable news contributors, and the campaign surrogates go on TV and echo this. And then celebrity surrogates echo this on social media and on, when they go on like The View. And poof, Joe Biden's the nominee. And without Biden shaking hands or appearing unscripted on camera. Remember when he disappeared for the first 2 weeks of quarantine? And hopefully, once we get through April, Joe Biden doesn't have to show up to another debate. And the media declares that he has won the nomination with some delegate, strange math projection that requires mental gymnastics. Checkmate. But let's get to the money making, the ad buys, and the convention theatrics with a target that even moderate Republicans enjoy attacking, Donald Trump. The Democratic Convention has been about theatrics since they turned it into a week-long cable news production. Since the vote trading shifted away from being on camera to the proverbial smoke-filled rooms with the senior campaign staff. The truth is that Democrats don't want to lock up the nomination to have a longer runway during the general. They want to lock up the nomination so they can stop wasting money on the primaries and progressives and start making money off of a two-way race against the branded enemy, Donald Trump. But nothing would show us at this point that the Democrats have learned anything from their horrific and historic loss in 2016. They haven't invested more money in field. They've means-tested fund allocation to state parties. They haven't leaned working class or populist. In fact, they've only doubled down on attacking popular policies like Medicare for all and refusing to support rent freezes during the pandemic. No, they have Scranton, Pennsylvania Joe Biden to be their working class mascot, who they can clip up into expensive 30-second ads against madman Donald Trump. Now, if they actually wanted to win, they would skim a bit off of that media budget. Instead of putting resources into buying more expensive ads in states that they think they can turn blue, like Texas, they'd invest in offices and organizers in states we horrifyingly lost in 2016. And actually, there might be enough money to do both. And of course, they continue to ignore and attack the Democratic base. Not just millennials, but the majority of working Democratic voters under 50 years old. 2016 showed us that we cannot take any voters for granted. We have to work or all the votes. But they don't actually win. There's a lot of money to be made in being in opposition to Donald Trump. And if they won, they'd have to answer to the largest, most diverse, and progressive generation in history. And the convention. Non-stop cable news coverage, scripted speeches by all the demos that the Democrats represent, and for show, even those who don't. But pay no attention to the protesters outside, or in the case of 2016, the hundreds of delegates walking out of the convention. We have a 4-star general attacking Trump. We have a Republican woman on stage attacking Trump. We have Michael Bloomberg and DeRay singing Kumbaya. See? We're a big tent. And have I mentioned the Democratic Governors Association's concerts and the Emily's List parties and the sponsorships like the Uber tent outside the convention and the MSNBC brunch? And of course, the sacred convention committee positions. The Democratic National Convention is heaven for lobbyists and corporations and grifters and consultants and fundraisers and Hollywood actors and agents and cable news contributors and, of course, the Twitter influencers. Why on earth would they cancel that? It's also a nonstop ad against Donald Trump. And if you have no actual campaign, this is the moment to raise money from the people and buy more ads. This is the moment you drive up the poll numbers without actually having to spend it on the ground. These high-paid consultants would have to shift their well-thought-out strategies and make way less money by canceling the convention. They can't do that, even if it means risking thousands of lives. Call me crazy. I don't think a convention and ads and ignoring the Democratic Party base in exchange for Bloomberg Republicans will win Biden the election. Call me crazy, but I think that the Democratic Party stakeholders know this too. I think Biden's consultants know. I mean, they're basically phoning it in at this point, right? I think that SKD knows. I think the appointed voting DNC members that SKD works with know. I think SKD's favorite client, Governor Andrew Cuomo, knows. And I think Andrew Cuomo is waging a nice little war against Trump on CNN for the next 4 years, so that he's perfectly situated with the largest DNC delegation coming from New York members who he has picked himself, with the DNC's chosen consultants working with him now, with his propaganda, nightly branding on CNN. With this pandemic, he is perfectly situated for 2024, which is why we cannot take our eyes off the prize, guys. Which is why we have to pay attention to the process, to budget negotiations, to who's on the DNC, how it's structured. We have to work on local races, run for the DNC positions, and support independent media who are exposing these things. This fight is only just beginning. It's not the time to give up. Now is the time to focus, to work together in true solidarity, not to be divided, not cause petty fights, not get distracted with Twitter fights with crazy people online. The establishment is not inept for losing. They're brilliant in making Trump an enemy. Even during a pandemic, they're putting money above the lives of their voters. They're kicking at the progressives nonstop, and they're giving tax breaks out to the rich. This fight, guys, just beginning. Michael Brooks, welcome to the Nomiki Show. First time appearance. Hopefully not the last time.
First time, long time.
That is very true. First time and long time.
That's right. Good to be back. Sort of.
Sort of.
Well, because we had our aborted mission yesterday, but
yeah,
it's awesome.
Tell people about that. Maybe
we had tech problems.
We had some tech problems. My microphone cut out halfway through the interview. You were on a roll, but maybe we can offer patrons that cut of the interview as some sort of like extra, because it's
okay.
Yeah,
go for it.
I don't know. I'm learning from you.
Absolutely. I mean, you said some kind of anti-Semitic stuff in there, but yeah, I don't hold it against you. If you want people to hear it, it's cool.
Now they're going to
I don't
demonetize
care.
me on YouTube because you just said that.
Oh, I said that in the first. Sorry, it was the first minute. Right, I should have
First
waited.
minute. We'll cut that.
Waited.
We'll put that at the end.
Yeah.
So, Michael, welcome to the show. Congratulations on being number one in the What is it? What section are you in? I was just looking at this.
It's political philosophy.
You're number one in media and internet in politics.
Boom.
You're killing it on Amazon. I guess people, no one's buying paper anymore. Maybe we're not even cutting trees anymore.
I'm telling people to buy it at this place called Red Emma's, which is this independent bookstore.
I love Red Emma's.
Yeah. So like don't buy it on Amazon. We're boycotting Amazon. But I will say if the numbers that's great.
Yeah.
Because that means because plenty of people are telling me that they're buying it independently. And if the numbers are still decent on Amazon, that's awesome. People seem to have some interest in the book. That's cool.
Red Emma's should do a, number one sold this week on the internet. And they have a cafe. For those who've never been to Red Emma's in Baltimore, have you been to the actual store?
I've actually never been to the actual store. I'm buddies with the guy who owns it. He actually he came to our Philly live show. And we've hung out a little bit, but I've never had the privilege. I was going to go do a reading there, but now we don't go places anymore.
No, we don't. You can do a virtual reading.
We don't do things anymore.
We don't. We just stare at our webcams all day long if we have one, drink on Zoom, and sometimes people jump in on our Zoom calls naked or, doing other shit like porn. It hasn't. We started to do passwords, but we don't have a password on this one, so who knows what's going to happen. Maybe someone will jump into our Zoom call.
Jesus Christ. They have done that to you?
No, they've done it to other people. I've been reading about it. So
I've been reading about it too. Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah. I heard about a guy who's running for Congress who did a town hall and they jumped in on their Zoom.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So some of them are horrible and some of them are pretty funny. That's actually funny.
No. Somebody did porno on a town hall, and it was a predominantly Muslim community. So you can imagine how horrifying that was. Yeah.
It's still a little funny though, on some level.
I think it's like intellectual dark web version 5. Is that no? I don't know.
No, it's more fun.
So in intellectual dark web, this is my kombucha. For those of you who are listening as a podcast, I'm drinking on camera. Not hard kombucha, but it makes
We've
me
seen
feel
you
like
drink on camera.
I've
been with you at debate nights. So you're like, Michael, hot. Because Andrew Cuomo because they got with the members of the IDC. Hold on, Sam. There was the IDC, and they were there, and they set a whole parameter for the debate you're seeing right now.
And
let me get another drink.
Let me get another spiked water, because that's all that's in that studio. Water.
It's
like rubbing alcohol in water.
0.2 alcohol percent.
I am a lightweight. You're giving it away.
Fermented guava.
I definitely bring those into the studio. All right. So you have this book. It's great. It's about the intellectual dark web. I have just started reading it as of last night. Not very far in because it's really hard to focus right now. Are you feeling that way too? Just in general?
It honestly, it goes in and out. I mean, sometimes it's extremely hard. Other times I am taking, there is some time to have more quiet and read books and whatever. So there is some of that going on. But obviously, of course it's hard there's a lot cooking right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And Twitter's not helping because
Twitter's not helping. Twitter is trash.
It is total trash.
I'm
ready. I'm ready to break up with Twitter, but I know it's too powerful of a tool, especially if you're selling a book. So tell me, okay, I really don't know a lot about the intellectual dark web. I'm aware of it because I live on the YouTubes, but I don't interact with it. And any experience I've had interacting with it, it's been because of Fox News. So it's not even legit, intellectual dark web. Meaning the Ben Shapiro's of the world. I know he's not technically, or maybe
he is technically part of it. Yeah.
I've debated him. He's an asshole.
Oh, really?
You needed to know that. Breaking news, guys. Yeah. He is an asshole.
Are you telling me that you had a heart that talking to Ben Shapiro was somehow not pleasant?
Well, some of them.
That's shocking.
They're assholes on TV. And then the minute the camera's off, they're genuinely nice people. Some of them.
Yeah, but not
Andrew Breitbart was like that.
Yeah, but not him. Come on.
No, not that.
There's no way that kid is pleasant.
No.
To be fair to him, I think he's got a very coherent personality. I don't think there's any difference, I would suspect, Like he's just gonna do that little motor mouth thing no matter what. I liked going on like really like when I was going on like I-24.
Oh yeah.
They would have me like occasionally I would get like, and actually I forget the guy's name, but he was some like British, like right wing, like pro-Israel guy. We had an Ilhan Omar debate and I kicked his ass. And he was actually like really, no, but it was funny. Like he definitely was like, it would be like 50-50. Like he was legit in the sense that he had the accent, he knew how to whatever. And the other people that they had on, like I started joking, like I don't care, it's pretty much done. But like I would joke to the bookers. I was like, all right, like Trump did something, I don't like it, and there's somebody who like escaped from an institution who does like a public access cable show who really digs it, and we're gonna debate. Like,
oh my god, no!
And I remember I loved.
And now they're like the communications directors for the White House.
Right, that was the thing. That's true. That's true. I definitely did. There were a couple of them that I'd look up after because I mostly had no idea who they were.
Right.
And it was like one or two I looked up after, and I was just like, "Oh my god, that person has like a real position."
A lot of them. My favorite was, we're so off topic, but my favorite was the weather girl from Fox News Weekends Mornings. She is now the communications director for the Defense Department. And she's like, in news in Afghanistan, it's sunny today. Like, what the fuck is she? Wait, that's where they were casting the communications people. So any complaints you have about Bernie Sanders and his, non-traditional team, just look at the White House right now. I mean, they're running a full propaganda unit and it's working.
Right. Yeah, but he needs to do that on the other side.
Exactly.
Right? Like after like, all right, I'm president, and now, I mean, yeah. So, I don't even know what the Bernie equivalent of that would be. Actually,
it would be us on Twitter. It would just be all of us. Be us. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what he's done, and you need fighters. You need people who can like take on Neera Tand and not be afraid of her like army of trolls. So let's talk about what you're here to talk about, which is your book.
Yes. Well, and really whatever.
And anything. Yeah. But I want to know. I want to learn from you. I don't want to actually read the book. I just want to talk to you and pretend I know.
I knew that this was that hustle, basically. It's a very well-written book, though.
Okay, fine. I'll read it. If you do say so yourself, it's a well-written book.
It is. I do say so myself.
Okay, so this intellectual dark web, kind of a new thing, at least in labels, in terms of like, people who do not live on the internet, it's new. Why are these people so influential? When we were talking yesterday, we talked a little bit about how they're preying on a portion of the internet that would be susceptible to this. Maybe people who think they're more intellectual than they are, or like, explain to me, what is this mechanism?
Like basically what's interesting to me about these people, and no doubt, like when I got contracted to write this book, like they were popping. They were getting profiled in the New York Times. They were like all over the place. Jordan Peterson was like an actual international sensation. Right. Now this stuff is way, 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 way less on the map. But I think what's interesting to me about it is I start the book with like just a metaphor basically that I got from my friend Bhaskar Sankara, who founded Jacobin magazine, right? And he wrote in a piece, I think for the New York Times, where he was like, look, like not literally, but let's just take these three destinations as three different ways of doing politics. Let's say there's Hungary, which is like the resurgence, which we see more and more every day, of right-wing authoritarian politics. Then let's take Singapore, and Singapore is actually also pretty authoritarian. It's very market-oriented, but it's technocratic. It has a certain type of diversity. It values, it has a different way of doing things, right? And you could definitely see like Mike Bloomberg, Davos, a lot of the people in the Democratic Party, this is the world that they idealize. This is the Fareed Zakaria world. And then he was saying, then there's like Finland Station. And Finland Station is where Lenin got back to basically like to go before the 1917 Russian Revolution. Some people get really triggered by this. This is not like a big conversation about the Soviet Union or whatever, though that's an interesting conversation. But it's just the idea that moment was a revolutionary moment. And the belief was, and I think this belief manifests in a variety of ways, whether we're talking about like the Workers' Party in Brazil or FDR or the African National Congress or 1917, this idea that like politics is really about expanding democracy into all spheres of life, including economic, right? That's a really simple way, I think, of kind of understanding a certain type of socialist viewpoint. And I think when you do have that kind of politics, you recognize that the world in terms of power right now is mostly a contest between Hungary and Singapore, and that Hungary is rising. And the interesting thing to me about the dark web was that it kind of is, because there is arguments inside of it, it covers a lot of Singapore style and Hungary style arguments for a popular audience. And I thought, really with the exception of what they don't have and what is more ascendant right now is this, like, not in terms of policy, but like people who are doing like actual right-wing populism, that is in terms of economics, that is not in there. But you could look at like Sam Harris as a Singapore style guru for sure. And you could look at Jordan Peterson, who did meet with Viktor Orban and does have this real fixation with mythology and natural hierarchy, as a Hungry sort of figure. And so what I think all of these people do is they take, they try to either naturalize hierarchies through science or through mythology, right? So like we can't really challenge how the market works because that just is what it is, right? And if you're
it's an assumed truth.
It's an assumed truth. It's like oxygen. And so that's the kind of like where they're coming from. And I think in terms of the weaknesses that they were able to appeal to, those that particularly when they were rising on the scene, the left was mostly associated in people's minds with just kind of like a narrow moralism, like, hey, don't say that, don't do that, that's not cool, blah, 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 without a kind of like more full, either compelling dynamic of argument of how we actually want things to be, or a big, broad set of answers for everybody. Right? Like if you can come out of 2008
that's right.
For several years and primarily not have like a big narrative that can actually speak to the crisis most people are going through, that's a huge failing. And I think they're a manifestation of exploiting that weakness, and we can provide way more compelling answers. And the last thing I'll just say real quick is I think like the conclusion of my book is by far what I'm most excited about, because I'm not going to like, I felt like there was a time where I did videos about these people because it is in this YouTube space. It is in this, you know, it's in the air. They're still around. They're still popular. They still matter. I don't want to, like, I'm kind of bored by them. I think that it's important to understand them and get where they fit. I don't really care. I know that some people, you know, say that I'm unfair, blah, blah, blah. They'll do the usual kind of complaining. But I think the bigger thing here is like, these arguments that they present are going to be arguments that are going to be with us for a long time, whether or not it's them making it. And that this kind of like cosmopolitan socialist viewpoint that I'm putting forward, I think actually is a really good answer or framework for a left that is way more confident, way more appealing, way more global, and also really materially grounded in people's lives. So that's what I'm excited about. And that's definitely what I try to do on my show.
Well, it's interesting because I the way that I see this, and I've studied a lot about Roger Ailes and sort of how 2 generations ago he attempted to tap into that generation's version of the disaffected, disenchanted, white man who felt like the government was becoming too diverse, too focused on women, too big business, whatever it is. It's actually very similar to the Trump same base, basically. It's just, that's a base that turns out in votes, and in a Republican primary, it was disruptive enough to get him Trump the election. But, for our generation, I think that their appeal this is their demographic, the way that they're going to be able to cling on to whatever version, whatever the right looks like moving forward in a country that is proving to be more and more populist, and our generation being more and more and younger, more and more populist, leftist, and just as you state, cosmopolitan, like literally actually cosmopolitan. More people are living in cities up until COVID. Who knows what's going to happen after this?
Yeah, who knows where people will go? Yeah.
So,
yeah, Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
So no, I'm just curious, like, what does cosmopolitan socialism mean um, for us moving forward? I mean, how does it look? What does it sound like? And how does it challenge these ideas that are not going away? They're just probably going to take another form with the next generation and the next technology and platform that allows them the ability to mobilize and speak out.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think that what's a little bit different about them is I think that part of it is like the through line of that kind of Roger Ailes thing for sure. But I think there's also a lot of there's a self-help element to it,
Right.
which is really different and really relevant. I also think there's people like, look, a guy like Sam Harris is a Democrat. Like it is not, and that doesn't mean anything to me, right? Like that's not a big reflection of somebody's politics, but it is broader than just that kind of like traditional, we're right wing and we're going to find what's kind of bugging people right now to get them. And I also think like, and this will like pivot into your question really specifically. I'm also like of the school that like, okay, even if it's primarily appealing to young men and primarily appealing to young white men, so what? Right? Like that's like the kind of thing too that like I thought there was so much doors. Like if you were say in that demographic and you're 18 and you're reading around, I actually have an anecdote like this. I was at an event in Boise, Idaho, and there was this really cool kid who was driving me around from DSA, came and met me at the airport, whatever, and we started talking. He was a really, really smart, I shouldn't say kid, like a young man, really smart, really together person. And, his trajectory was like, yeah, I started getting interested in this sort of thing. It felt like, I could read some like piece about why like I shouldn't like Seinfeld or I sucked because whatever, and then I would look at like a conversation with Sam Harris or something, and they were talking about science and they were talking about different ideas, some of which are kind of interesting. And then maybe they were also now in retrospect promoting some politics I totally don't agree with, but it made a lot of intuitive sense. And then he said, and again, this just happened to be me. I think there's a lot of people like this. He found me and other kind of people. It was like, first was like, okay, you had really good debunks, but also like you were talking about my life. You weren't just saying like, oh, you're privileged, blah, 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 blah. You're talking about my student loans. You're talking about my healthcare. You're talking about my parents' retirement. You're talking about real shit. You're not just like giving another kind of like sort of simplistic, moralistic view of the world. And so I think like my specific angle with this like kind of like globalized view of socialism and a globalized answer is that there's sort of like these two tendencies right now that are really showing up, and they kind of cut across right and left. And one is this idea that like there are not universals. There really are only like culturally mediated experiences, and we cannot have common bonds beyond them. And it's funny because in the United States, I think a lot of people associate like there is a certain type of woke argument that really makes this case. And it gets really like, I just had this woman, Joanna Vista, on my shows, like talking about how really important research and disparity studies have been weaponized in the policy process in the last decade to undermine things like Medicare for all. Like it's literally undermined absolutely necessary policy efforts, right? And then even way more dangerously, we see like Hungary, and we see this kind of like resurgent nationalism, and there's this Israeli intellectual who's writing like the new democracy has to be nationalistic. There cannot be universal standards. There only is the nation state, and the nation state defines its own community, period. Like that's it, right? So you got this like rising tendency. And in response to a lot of the people, and again, the dark web represents different things around this too, because there's definitely a lot of stuff that I consider to be anti-Muslim. There's definitely all sorts of very toxic racial and gender stuff from my perspective, no question. But these are also people who are to some extent holding a perverse view of the opposite, which is that like, yes, there are universal values, there are universal standards, and those things came from the West. Basically, right? Like, so in this, and I'll loop it like this. In the 1990s, there was a really big argument with the so-called like Asian tiger countries, like countries like Malaysia and Singapore. And they would say, like, fuck you. We do human rights. We have a different conception of human rights because we're Confucian. So we don't just valorize the individual. And then Western critics would be like, you guys are full of it. You're obviously violating people's right to free speech or whatever. And everybody wants the same thing. And what Amartya Sen, who's a big influence on this book, who's this Indian economist, came forward and was like, both sides of this equation are wrong, in the sense that like 100% there are universals. And if we don't have an ability to build universals, there's also going to be no left project, because the only way labor could ever confront power is with masses of people. And if you can't build serious bonds, not just with like shared moral commitments or shared ways of talking, that is always going to be really small. You need to build something out much bigger, much more inviting, and much more aggressive. And then on the other hand, what San said was where the Western chauvinists are wrong is that let's actually read everybody and look across the world. And of course we can find in Confucianism or in Islam or anywhere the building blocks of open societies, freedom of speech, holding power accountable, whatever, inquiry. And even when we get into like, what is the West? Like, that's bullshit. Greece, what was ancient Greece included was African, it was Pan-Asian, particularly by the time we get to Rome. So what I'm trying to say actually is one, it's like, the answer to these guys is like, yes, there is like this compelling global experience we can have that really enlarges our perspective. It doesn't shrink it. It doesn't get us into these narrow arguments. It actually really widens the lens. And it's a much more exciting way of being in the world. And I think, and then what answers to them and also coalesces with building that serious socialistic, anti-racist, and globalized movement is this idea that we literally have to cross-pollinate across boundaries. Like when I do histories on my show of like, we just did 2 parts on Samara Machel, who was this Mozambican revolutionary. There's relevance in things that he put across to 2020 right now where we are, 100%. And not like a stretch, like, oh, I can see how that. It's like, no, like very direct parallels. So we can start to be this way. And I think that, it also provides a way more compelling way of taking on this stuff than being woke. Because instead of essentializing, instead of policing, instead of like narrowing the scope, you're actually really widening it. So that's
Absolutely.
what I'm trying to do.
And that's kind of, you and I have had this conversation offline quite a bit, our allergy to woke culture. And it's ironically triggering for a lot of people who identify as DSA members and are democratic socialists of our generation who live in these cosmopolitan, cities. They live in New York. There's several chapters of DSA in New York. And oftentimes, if they're in the electoral groups, it kind of the electoralism gets distracted by the need to create the appearance of being woke because it is a tool of organizing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Meaning the way that electoral politics works in America is, okay, we need to make sure that the African-American base over the age of 60 shows up or else we don't win. We need to make sure that the Latino neighborhood turns out. And so suddenly the language of electoralism is not so much about what you're saying, opening and broadening the base, but about basically micro-targeting and finding people that represent those neighborhoods and represent, traditional political language for older voters who may not necessarily digest, intersectional, economic, whatever type of language you have. So, this is, the reason I asked about the cosmopolitan side of this is how in an era where we are trying to organize our generation, which is still, is falling into wokeness, which is not a new thing. This has happened, like you just said, throughout history. Identity has been thrown out there as a weapon or putting factions against each other, whatever it is, wherever somebody's from. But I think like our struggle as being, millennials and younger, being the largest and most diverse generations in history, who are dealing with an extraordinary economy and just likely to get much, much worse. How is it that we can, number one, stay in solidarity, but then also appeal to older demos the way that Bernie Sanders wasn't able to, because he was trying to speak to our generation, but he couldn't at the same time speak to an older generation that just is not there. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a lot there.
there's a lot.
To me, it's like, no, it's good. I think, first of all, I think a lot of this like woke stuff, what's interesting to me, like, I think it's actually extremely narrow and extremely American and speaks to extremely small demos.
Yeah.
So I would make, and this is what I'm trying to do here is like, I think on one hand, what has really been lost, and actually people were constantly talking about like, oh, Bernie Sanders needs how to learn how to do this, needs how to learn to do that. And there was some truth to that at times, which I'll get to in a second. But it's like, everybody needs to learn how to do what actually he did fantastically, which is speak in clear, moral, and obvious narratives about things that affect 99% of people.
Exactly.
And you need to do that. That's the material ground of it. There is a part that is like, and I've talked with Adolf Reed about this, like, you can't, the part where it's like the distinction between like, okay, we're gonna do an action, we're gonna work on something. Obviously, if somebody shows up to a meeting and is like saying all sorts of like bigoted things and they can't sit next to somebody because they're from a different background or whatever, that's not going to work. You literally can't work from that base. Now, on the flip side, maybe somebody's going to come to a meeting and they're not trained in all of the various speaking patterns that you're used to. Maybe they have a different set of cultural preferences. Maybe they don't accept, like, they can accept like the very clear broad base of like opposing sexism or racism, but maybe they don't agree with all of your specific attunements and your very narrow definition of what that actually means. So I think on one part, there's actually just like getting back to really simple, like, look, if you go home and watch and listen and do whatever the hell you want, as long as you're like not hurting anybody, and then we'll do politics together. And it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what your cultural practices are. Like, I actually think there needs to be just some real, like, getting totally out of like, this is not a social club.
Right.
It's actually literally not a safe space, because I'll even just like take it at face value. Like, that's cool. If you want to generate that, then generate that. That's a different activity. Like, create a small support group with a small group of people who are working through something together. That's totally valid. That's not politics. So I think that's one part of it.
And it's easy. I mean, I have to say, like, it's a very cheap way of dealing with politics. I think a lot of folks can get quick, easy wins on the internet through being provocative with woke and cancel culture, because it's an easy way to work through your enemies. It's an easy way to mobilize people, but it's not going to deliver you the long-term wins that we all need.
And it's not real wins. Like, it might be a win for like a career advancement or whatever, but it's not appealing to a broad set of people, and it's literally not a win. I mean, like, this is what I'm saying. Like, even stuff that's actually more like real but difficult. Like, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe with COVID, maybe we're entering something different. But that period of weeks where people were saying like, oh, well, Bernie lost, but 60% of people support single payer, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He lost. That's literally the only thing that mattered. So don't tell yourself a bedtime story. We have to figure out what the problem was and how. And I think the next two parts here that I want to say that are related to that question, though, is like on another area where I don't care about the terminology. Like, I don't think cosmopolitan socialism is something to throw around for a whole bunch of people. But the attitude I'm talking about is, well, number one, okay, so let's go back to Bernie. Bernie's coalition needs to be way more diverse. 100% correct, no doubt. Well, first of all, let's frame it as an addition and not a subtraction, because we don't want to lose what was already built. That's how because we're trying to like win.
Which he did, by the way.
Right. Which he did. And that's a major problem. Exactly. And then secondly, what are the actual strategies and literacies to actually do that? Because then it becomes like, well, if your task is to appeal, like, let's just take it in a hypothetical direction. If I need to persuade my grandmother in Long Island to vote for Bernie Sanders, I am not going to hire or talk to, like a 22-year-old like anti-Israel Jewish activist from Swarthmore. Like, you know, so then that was the second part. It's like, even when it's true, then what are we actually doing here? And then that brings me to the third part, which to me is really paradoxical. And I always find like kind of funny with my show, because like I'm very willing and increasingly just totally intolerant of this kind of like identitarian bullshit in the Adolf Reed terminology. And then at the same time, it's like I actually see so many conversations where it's just like, I think calling the black vote is actually really problematic. I think it's totally inaccurate. It literally, and this is a favorite word, erases a massive amount of distinctions of geographic, ideological, and economic diversity inside one of the most important dynamic communities globally, not just in the United States. So then all of a sudden to have a dynamic where like a whole bunch of cynical Democratic Party operatives who will use this discourse for a day and they'll throw it out tomorrow, they don't give a fuck. They will make it that, well, all the black vote is African Americans over 60 in South Carolina. That's it. It is certainly not an immigrant from Trinidad and Brooklyn. It is certainly not a labor union organizer in Wisconsin. It is definitely not, you know, somebody who has like a small chain of businesses in Southern California, or maybe it is, depending on who they're contributing to. But it's definitely this one very specific slice. And then that's cynically wielded against Bernie. And then on the flip side, yeah, there is this other discourse of like, right, that does need the approach needs to be different. And therefore, like, you know, okay, but who, like, obviously, like, Nina Turner's an incredible campaigner, and Bernie did bring in people that were really amazing. In fact, one of the things that frustrates me is I actually see a lot of this from outside of the campaign itself, even. But I see people who didn't even support Bernie, and definitely people around Warren and elsewhere, is sort of like, well, X, Y, and Z needs to be done, but we actually are totally not the ones to do it.
Right.
And we don't have the discursive strategies. We don't have, so, you know, it's like.
The Warren facade of like, they kept saying, oh, you keep erasing all these diverse, you know, women who've supported Warren. It's like, no, those were the diverse, notable women who supported Warren. On the actual voting side, it was a bunch of white, wealthy, highly educated people that are New York Times, you know, readers, and that's it. Like, they won the New York Times.
That's like literally
audience.
it. Like, including like more men when you like broke down the. So I think, like, to me, this attitude that I'm talking about would actually really get into way more intricacy. I think it would both at the same time try to historicize things and try to look at things in a more like less moralistic and more economic and political lens. And then on the other hand, it actually would say, like, it isn't just sufficient to have like a strategy for this or that group. It's actually like, you better fucking understand something about this or that group, both in their own terms and also how it relates to a broader experience. Because that's the funny thing to me about so much of those discourses, is that they actually they're really essentializing the ways that we reject as from like a socialist position, but they're also just like, they erase in their own terminology so much nuance and so many things that are necessary to properly communicate a message and also build things in peer-to-peer relationships. Because the last thing I'll say, like, you see, absolutely, there's people who like totally bitch and complain about the South Carolina vote in ways they 100% should not. They reveal a lot of nonsense when they say it, no doubt, right? I totally agree with that. And then there's other people that are like, well, because it's the South Carolina, like, you can't talk about it, which is also totally ridiculous. And then other people even use, and we started to see this like in 2017, like literally white people like tweeting like gifs of or, you know, memes of like, you know, black women going to vote, like almost as if all these bizarre, and they are mostly boomer liberal white people. It's like they are essentializing it to make it. It's like, this isn't Green Mile. This is the country.
That's what
it's actually
Warren
really offensive.
Was.
And really, it's horrifying. So
it was an emblem. I was like, 100%. I wanted to say, and many of my good friends were those women who were diverse, great activists, by the way, have great reputations for the work that they do in their communities. And I legitimately think they wanted a woman that was leaning progressive. And maybe they didn't get phone calls from Bernie Sanders, which is his own issue, is that he's not very good at the politics and the outreach. We're humans and people like to get personal phone calls. So I hear them on that sense. But with that being said, the entire campaign was like, it was like an emblem for the white wealthy woman, possibly former Hillary voter, most likely, who was feeling guilty and wanted to look like she had a bunch of, women of color as friends. And this is what were their ways of making up for it.
Yeah,
the 2016 election, because they also painted that narrative. Sorry, just a side note.
No, go ahead.
The narrative about blaming white women for Donald Trump was also completely false. I mean, it was white men who were wealthy that won him the election, and in several cases, their wives or partners voted with them, which is completely congruent with all historical trends, not just 2016. What lost Hillary the vote, let's just say it over and over again, was the fact that she did not engage working people. She lost people who made under $45,000 a year. She didn't show up in places like Philadelphia, which is a stronghold for Democrats. She didn't show up in places like Wisconsin, as we know. And at the end of the day, it didn't have to do with all of these identity, they tried to blame it on identities. It blamed the white woman and black women show up. They do, sure. But guess what? Nobody did under $45,000 a year in the Democratic Party at the rates that she needed to. And that's what she didn't want to address. So it becomes an excuse, as you know, and in a way.
No, I think I love it. And I think like what's also right is just is actually coming at it from both directions, which is either like, let's just take the top lines and realize that this is just a really simplistic, misleading way of understanding what happened electorally, or let's go in the opposite direction and really get into the intricacies of what we're talking about here. Because even like just the discourse, like, look, I don't care. You want to talk about like the privilege of white men or whatever, that's fine. And there's obviously relative truth to it. It's fine. I think, I think it's a little bit 2014, but I think, but there's truth to it. Of course, there's no doubt. Nobody would deny it. There's truth to that. And at the same time, like a discourse that would suggest that somebody, in Akron making $18,000 a year is privileged,
right?
Because their name is Bob Smith and they're a straight white guy, is like, it's insane. Like, it's not just wrong, it's like demented. And I think the other thing that is important to look at here, and this is another parallel I want to draw with Adolph Reed, because Adolph Reed then, first of all, he also talks about the problem with like the brokerage role then. If you make demographics and different populations like not just human beings with specific histories and specific trajectories, but like magical things that need to be understood, then it becomes like not politics. It becomes like, okay, I need to like have somebody that can understand the secret psychology of like the Jewish electorate or whatever, versus just like, yes, of course, you need to hire people from different backgrounds, and you need people who are literate and competent across the board, but there isn't like these magical keys that take different groups of people outside of history, right? And I think like the other thing that I wanted to note that I really got from Adolph Reed was like, if you go to the 1990s, and of course it's not the same, like the damage is not the same, but it's fascinating to me because if you look at the 1990s, we all know Republicans did this, but Democrats were all over this. Like, we would say, yes, there's poverty and crime in urban America because of deindustrialization, because American apartheid basically ended like 40 years ago legally, and there has been nothing systemically to adjust that at all. Not only has there been nothing systemically to adjust that, as soon as it started like legally started to come down, we basically start gutting America's social infrastructure. So of course, we're going to go into the 1990s and there's going to be problems, right? But everybody, the New Republic, everybody was all over like, oh, and Bill Clinton, the cultures of poverty, and it's not because of all the obvious things. It's because of rap music, like all of this shit. Now most people kind of understand that if they don't really want to talk about it, but most people understand that was super racist, very embarrassing and pathetic. Now, it is not the same thing, because there's no doubt that the stakes of anti-African American racism is completely different. And I wouldn't even call like anti-white rhetoric is not racist in the same sense. We all understand that. But if we were to look at this stuff just as like, forget the content, let's just say we're like playing a game or we're writing a screenplay, you know, like you get a book like about how to write a screenplay, and it's like, you know, it's like, hey, whether you're writing like Beverly Hills Cop or fucking Field of Dreams or whatever, it's all the same structure, right? All of the shit that you see coming out from like woke stuff to explain the Trump electorate is the same narrative structure as the stuff about poverty in the 90s. It's all, these people are just, they just don't get it. They've got bad morals. They don't know how to work. And then of course it's, you know, totally layered with the, like the same thing you were talking about earlier, which is like, well, I can feel good about myself because I'm not one of these other, you know, terrible white people that's a racist. I have to say, as much as I'm like rejecting identitarian politics, there isn't a single trajectory of bad politics that doesn't start from affluent suburban white people or urban white people. So you have this whole other dynamic, and nobody's looking at even the material base of the Trump vote. Someone made this, I'll be real quick, someone made this great point to me, like, even in like these, okay, say you're in some depressed little town in Maine, there's no jobs. Yeah, probably you don't have it's very possible you don't have super enlightened attitudes. But you're also going to a Trump rally because the person who owns the quarry, which is maybe the only place in town where you can get a job, is going to be at that rally. Your minister probably is, which is the only social cohesion group. And then who else? The cop chief and the fire chief, in case anything goes down, you know? Yeah. You don't want to get a fucking ticket for driving drunk. Like, even that has a material base. And I think people need to get just really unlearn, particularly in America, and definitely liberals, stop looking at like these moral narratives of why things happen. That's usually not where things start.
This is the time when you gotta support independent media, guys. I gotta be honest with you. Everyone's feeling the pressure right now. All of the eyes are going to corporate media, and your good friends in independent media have been putting in the work on their own to build strong shows, to talk about things that may not be seeing the light on corporate news. And if you can support independent media and you haven't before, or if you can dig a little bit deeper in your pockets, this is the time to do it. So please join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. We are reconfiguring our show because I have a studio at home now and I can produce more content. So we're doing 2 live streams a week on YouTube. Tuesdays, a regular live stream. Thursday, we are doing a Superchat, both at 7 p.m. Eastern. And if you're a patron, you get the full show early, several days early, and extra content and some swag and behind the scenes stuff. And, you know, I'm just going to come up with lots of different ideas. Think about all the money you're saving by not, you know, going out for drinks, especially if you're a New Yorker, that you're saving by not spending money on gas, by not, you know, buying coffees. In my case, I'm taking my coffee money and I'm investing it in other independent media shows, because this is the time folks need you. Thank you to all of you for your support. If you are a patron and you're struggling, please message me. We'll figure it out. Well, we are all dealing with our own crises at home, and frontline workers are out there fighting the fight for us with the COVID crisis. We can't ignore the politics that's happening behind the scenes, because if there's anything that politicians know how to do, it's to make sure to use a crisis to distract away from what they're already doing in back rooms. And of course, I'm talking about the Democratic National Committee. They are great at distracting, putting on theatrical productions, and making you feel like there's democracy when really they're in the back room making their own decisions. And I have been obviously obsessed with the DNC's, you know, structure for a long time, and there are not a lot of people who are interested enough to focus on it when it's not important, who have the sourcing, who know how to comb through the receipts and follow the money. But I am so grateful that Sludge, if you don't follow Sludge, go to readsludge.com. that they're doing this work. David Moore is one of the co-founders of Sludge, and he has been doing a series on the DNC structure, the membership, the committees, and finally, someone has done an article on Perkins Coie, which we'll get to. David, thank you for for joining us from your undisclosed location. You can see how excited I am because when we were on the Unity Reform Commission, we were ringing the alarms on this law firm about why it was so important that people knew they have a monopoly, not just on the DNC, but the Democratic Party, and what that means other than, everybody uses them, that it's actually way more than that. So David, tell us a little bit about Perkins Coie as a law firm in general, and then we'll get into some of the nuggets. Sure,
sounds great. So I'm very grateful to have a chance to share some of our reporting. So Perkins Coie, it's the top DNC law firm, but here's a key starting fact. It's not just the DNC's law firm. It also represents the DCCC, the DSCC, and lots of other Democratic super PACs and other Democratic groups nationally. So while the DNC's contract with Perkins Coie is one of the DNC's largest, the multi-million-dollar annual contract, it's not the only Democratic money it gets. The Perkins Coie sees about some $21 million last year from different Democratic Party groups, and that includes super PACs. And also Perkins Coie represented many of the leading presidential campaigns, most of the leading moderate campaigns, most of them except for those of Senator Bernie Sanders and former Vice President Joe Biden. Also, Perkins Coie is based in Seattle. A huge law firm, of course, with hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. And its major corporate clients include 4 of the top 20 lobbying spenders in DC. So right there already you're getting into a firm that's got a tremendous imprint. And those 4 companies who are Perkins Coie's clients are Amazon, Boeing, Facebook, and Google. So those are 4 of the top 20 right there who spend millions of dollars annually on the Hill. And then also you've got other Seattle, sort of close companies like Microsoft, as well as the defense aerospace company Honeywell, and oil and gas like Texaco and Conoco, those giants. So what our investigation turned up about Perkins Coie that we'll lead into in a moment is the extent to which their oil and gas practice is much, much deeper than had been previously reported. And a look into lobbying records shows that Perkins Coie has been advocating with the Trump administration to weaken greenhouse gas emission regulations around renewable fuel standards.
And this, of course, ties to the lobbyists and money and really take it out of the party's platform. And, of course, there was a lot of pushback on that. But let's put a pause on oil and gas for a second, because I want to understand why law firms are so powerful in these situations. I think I've heard this on chats with really intelligent people saying, oh, well, whatever, everybody uses Perkins Coie, from somebody who's running for Congress. True story. A lot of really honest, even grassroots candidates use Perkins Coie to do their compliance, to set up their FEC filings and make sure that things are running smoothly. And that's big business, especially because the DCCC and the DSCC will push this law firm on them. But these other clients, whether it's oil and gas or tech or defense related industries, I think what's really shocking about that is, and just the cover of law firms. What I mean by that is, they're working with all these industries that have had played a significant role in blocking progress in the Democratic Party for the last 15 to 20 years. And they really are the 2 or 3 industries that have corrupted the party. And I don't say that I say that because that is where the corruption is coming from. The members on the DNC committees that you're covering, that are the lobbyists, that are holding up progress in this party, that are holding up reforms, those are not elected members. Those are appointed members from the industries that this law firm is also representing.
You're right that
corrupting forces are coming from these industries, essentially.
You're right that one of the key factors in Perkins Coie's influence is its revolving door with Democratic administrations. So a look into the Perkins Coie figures who have figured prominently, and who of course were not elected by DNC members or by voters in a state or nationally. It includes, former President Obama's former top lawyer, Bob Bauer, returned to go work at Perkins Coie. It also included a former Goldman Sachs lobbyist, Mark Patterson, who was a former secretary, who was the chief of staff to former Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner during the Obama administration. And there are more examples. There's other like this. Peter Rouse is another former top aide who had been chief of staff to Treasury secretaries and who joined Perkins Coie. And in fact, it goes back even further, where the national firm-wide chair of Perkins Coie's law practice is Mark Elias. He's in some ways often referred to as the Democrats' top lawyer. Has played a huge role in legal brouhahas representing Democrats over the past decade, and was the Clinton campaign's top lawyer. People might remember his role in the 2016 primary in a couple of ways, but previous to his role representing the Hillary Clinton campaign, he helped to write a provision for money in politics that was passed by Congress. So our investigation on Sludge gets into how Mark Elias and Perkins Coie contributed to the current rules around super PAC operations and money in politics. And now Perkins Coie represents many of the top Democratic super PACs that are already active have been active in recent elections, and now in this election are beginning to spend in favor of Joe Biden.
What is this? When was this legislation passed? What is the legislation? In 2016, when I first started to look into Perkins Coie, I initially thought, that they were getting transaction fees and they were used as sort of a cover for moving the money from super PACs to the DNC to the state parties and then back up, if you recall, and then to Hillary Clinton's campaign because, just looking at the FEC filings, I was realizing she was, money was coming in and out. And she was able to bring in a lot of money at certain points of her campaign through these entities that she could legally move that money through. And that is a new concept. Jeffrey for himself said it was money laundering. So the thing that they all had in common was that they were all using Perkins Coie. And then when we highlighted that on the commission and previously, Mark Elias got very upset publicly. And I just always thought that there was something there, whether it was through using it as a cover because law firms don't have to, there's no FEC, there's no trail. And they're probably getting some sort of transaction fee every single time. But I'm very curious to hear, when did this get set up and have you been able to uncover anything else?
Mm-hmm. Our reporting found that in 2010, Mark Elias and Perkins Coie filed an advisory opinion with the FEC that led to the creation of super PACs. We linked to that the primary source document in our article. Wait.
2010 was when Citizens United was passed, right?
That's correct. That's when it was. Okay. That's when it was decided. Yeah.
Decided. Yeah. Okay.
And so you're exactly right. And then in 2014, we cite a Politico article that found that Mark Elias was the author of a provision passed by Congress that greatly expanded the amount of money that individuals can give to national party committees, such as the DNC, each year. And folks listening along can search for the headline, "The Man Behind the Political Cash Grab," and find a Kenneth Vogel article from 2014 on Politico.com.
Man. So in terms of a law firm, how much do they have to disclose about this business that they're doing?
Well, one of the questions that we've been asking DNC leaders who are on these committees is if there's any independently verifiable process for DNC members or even just state parties or grassroots party members, the kind of people who are following along and watching this, to have a sort of oversight over the DNC chair's decisions and processes. And what we keep hearing back is that there are no such accountability mechanisms currently on DNC committees, and that the DNC, in fact, an ethics expert, Craig Holman, who's a government ethics expert with Public Citizen, gave us a quote that described how the DNC works as a private corporation, and even in ways that where even other private corporations that seek to have procedures for conflict of interest, where a potential conflict of interest is identified, discussed, and there's a process where those procedures, our reporting has found has been lacking within the DNC. So
non-existent in the DNC.
Yes,
I will editorialize.
No, that's I think that's inaccurate. Based on our reporting and on the lack of response from DNC officials, that's accurate. That no one's been able to demonstrate that the DNC is even following what's in its own bylaws, which calls for a quote avoidance of conflict of interest, and for written reports to be circulated by the Budget Committee on the effectiveness of expenditures to DNC members. Multiple DNC members told us that the DNC Budget and Finance Committee is failing to perform its job on that front, and the party was not able to demonstrate that any of these written reports had been submitted. And Perkins Coie's client list it expands to include a small oil refineries coalition for which it's lobbying several other energy companies, and of course Amazon, which was, as we've seen recently, is engaging in violations of the freedom of association, as we saw with the recent workplace action here in New York City in the coronavirus safety situation.
When we were starting to draft the Reform Commission's conflicts clause, it was something that while a lot of people were paying attention to the superdelegates and maybe some of the other reforms, this was a real fight that was happening behind the scenes. I got a tremendous amount of pushback. And actually, other things were being used as excuses for the pushback on the people that were pushing for this conflicts of interest clause was something that was my resolution that I put forward. But, that was advice I was given by people unnamed folks who had come to me and said, Perkins Coie is a law firm that nobody has had a conversation about why they're being hired, what they're doing. Nobody knows in the DNC what they're up to, why it is that they have a monopoly. There are tons of law firms out there that do compliance work. This is not compliance work. This is other types of work. And, and law firms, generally speaking, can provide cover for this type of work that may not be able to be done just independently within the DNC, whether it's research, oppo. I mean, research is anything from opposition research on Donald Trump, which came out through Perkins Coie. And if you recall, there was the dossier, Steele dossier that they produced, or opposition research and actions against the left, which I think is a real thing. We were getting targeted on the Unity Reform Commission, and mysteriously, when I complained to one of the vice chairs of the DNC about being targeted with harassment and death threats, it stopped within a minute. And, that kind of operation, while not everything is disclosed in this era, it's much harder to find when it's happening within a law firm. This isn't, this is what Harvey Weinstein did. This is what a lot of people do, is they use their law firms as essentially organizations to do their dirty work.
And for viewers might recognize Mark Elias's name, not just from the Steele dossier, which of course Perkins Coie commissioned and which, was later became a national news story, but also because that he was copied on the secret agreement between the Hillary Clinton campaign in August 2015 and the DNC, the secret fundraising
fundraising agreement. Yeah.
The joint fundraising agreement that funneled money from the DNC to the Clinton campaign, and without the awareness or the oversight of the other DNC members and the leading on the committees. So the first paragraph of our story on the top Democratic law firm that helps companies dodge climate regulations has resources on this crucial question that you've identified, of the crucial issue you've identified of the revolving door between Perkins Coie and Democratic administrations.
Yeah, and I think what's taking the joint fundraising agreement a little bit further, what was mysterious to me is, you had Hillary Clinton's super PACs, which are not allowed to interact or give money to the Clinton campaign, giving money to the DNC. And then the DNC was giving money to the Clinton campaign. And sometimes they take it down to state parties and back up. So it was a real money operation. And Republicans do this too. So listen, this isn't like a Democrats only. We're very good at it on the Democratic Party side because it's distracting and there's nobody shining light on it. I mean, the Democrats won't shine light on the Republicans for doing some of this stuff because they do it too. But that's really where the corruption is, in my opinion. So I really I commend you on doing this. Have you gotten any sort of response from Perkins Coie, Mark Elias, the DNC, any of them?
Perkins Coie acknowledged receipt of a list of questions, but did not respond to any of the questions regarding its work for the DNC and how it viewed any potential conflicts of interest with its fossil fuel clients or its large corporate clients like Amazon and Facebook. The DNC has not responded to our multiple requests for comment for this DNC reporting series over the past several months. And there's more to come on Sludge as we take a final story to come out on the two committees that we haven't yet profiled, the Resolutions Committee and the Credentials Committee, both of which are interesting because of the role that the Resolutions Committee played in the climate debate last year. But the Credentials Committee going forward has an interesting role where now that it looks like the DNC convention in Milwaukee is in a state of flux, is what I'll say as of this moment. Who knows what's going on? Who can look ahead to what's going to happen in August? The DNC needs to enshrine its superdelegate reforms in its charter and bylaws because it has not done that yet. It's been operating by a process of voice vote, as you know it, because you helped to craft the Unity Reform Commission's announcement. And so there's this key question that others, including Larry Cohn, have raised in in These Times article earlier this week. DNC member Larry Cohn, who I know you worked with on the Unity Reform Commission, that the credentials members will be able to in turn help evaluate who the superdelegates are who are able to advance resolutions for consideration at whatever the convention happens to be. And if the reforms are set to be enshrined, then that's going to be... And
who knows when those credentials committees meet, or the platform committee even, which usually meet a few weeks in advance to the convention.
Typically, yes, that's what our sources in the DNC told me. In fact, it's often just the weekend before. But now I don't know that the schedule has been distributed even to the DNC members. Yeah. Folks can ask their state party to ask their national DNC members what the communications have been, and we can push for greater transparency of communication from the DNC chair's office and ask Tom Perez to follow some basic protocols for how the private corporation works.
Yeah, exactly. The private corporation that has a tremendous effect on democracy. Very normal. Very, very, very normal. David, super interesting reporting. We will love to have you back on to discuss more. Hope you're staying safe, staying at home, staying healthy.
I am. Thank you.
Keep up the great work.
I really appreciate the chance to talk.
Thank you to Michael Brooks from The Michael Brooks Show, dear friend, for showing up in his PJs to join us. And thank you to David Moore for doing the hard work and investigating the DNC. Guys, this is the time to support independent media, so if you're not already, please click subscribe, click the little bell, click like, click share, and if you have it in your heart, join us on Patreon. Patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, so we can do more shows. And join us on Tuesdays and Thursdays on YouTube, 7 p.m. for our live streams. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay home.